Evening all. Not sure if anyone's out there. I can't see from this view. All right, got a few people on there by the look of it. Looks like we've set this up as a webinar, so we can't see your screens, but jump on to the chat function if you've got any questions, and we can certainly answer them as we go. We could have set this up as a interactive video. Anyway, it's a webinar. It is. I'll share my screen in a minute or so. Once we kick into 9 o'clock. So for those who don't know me, Mark Ferguson, CEO at neXtgen Agri. We're doing this project on behalf of Agrifutures around advancing the fibre goat industries of Australia, and that's obviously cashmere and Angoras. In Oz, the mohair industry is a bit bigger than the cashmere industry, and in New Zealand, where I'm actually based, it's probably a bit more, with cashmere having a bit of a push at the moment, maybe a bit more suited to those. So yeah, so anyway, so the project is, so I guess it ends up being 90% mohair because that's a bigger proportion of the industry, but we'll talk about both types of goats tonight. I'll grab I'll get my screen up and we'll start going through it. G'day, Susan. Nice to have you along. And feel free to chat as we chip along. Sorry, that's going to be written rather than spoken. Let's get the screen up. Righto, hopefully that's all clear. You got a thumbs up there, Buckles? Yep, excellent. Righto. So talking about breeding in fibre goats, so I'll frame that as breeding your perfect fibre goat, and I guess that's mainly to make a point that we're all going to have different ideas about what is perfect, and it's sort of not my job or anyone's job really to tell you exactly what to breed towards. I suppose it's more about how to breed. That is what I want to talk about tonight. Obviously some ideas on what to breed as well. There's only a few things that make you money in these things, so we've got to get that bit right, but I guess we're all going to have slightly different ideas on a range of traits, and we'll cover them as we go. None of this is meant to be it's not meant to be prescriptive. It's meant to be sort of a discussion really around what you think is important. But I guess a bit of my background. So yeah, it was my first love really, Angora goats, in terms of agriculture. So we started running them when I was pretty young, 12 or something. So these are a couple of bucks that we bred back in the day, a fair while back now, but probably still my favourite photo, so that's why it's there in terms of our Angora experience, some of the Africans we brought out. But yeah, long history breeding them. My brother Tim still runs them, and his family with JC and Mez and co. So yeah, strong affiliation with fibre goats. Haven't had a lot of experience in cashmere, but certainly plenty in mohair, which has been a great upbringing, a great industry to learn a lot of things about, and a really great animal to work with, as many of us on the call will know. Pretty quite malleable, quite interesting to breed. So pretty scary to start with an equation like that on this time of night, but that's I guess our aim if we're serious about breeding is making genetic gain. So that's the G on the left hand side of your screen, and this is what we do for a living at neXtgen Agri across the sheep and cattle industries, and no different in goats. That our job is to make genetic gain year on year, as well as run them as best we can. Quick hide on the sharing bit. What am I hiding? Hide. Excellent. Is that better? All right. Thank you. Thanks, Buckles. Yeah. So selection this is a component. So we need to sort of get sorted when we're trying to make genetic gain, and this doesn't matter whether you're breeding bucks or whether you're just breeding commercial animals. Obviously, whatever you're doing, you're trying to each year's generation has got to be better than the last. So the bits that we can play with are the selection intensity, and we'll go through each of these, the accuracy of that selection, the genetic variation that naturally exists, and so we can do things about that, but that's sort of largely fixed, although we've done some importations over the previous years that have helped achieve more genetic variation. And then the generation interval, which is how quickly we turn them over. So all of these things control how fast we go in terms of genetic gain. Probably the one that we're going to spend most of our time talking about is accuracy, because that's the one that we actually have most control over. A lot of us in the fibre go industries don't have massive herds, so we're dealing with smallish numbers. So our selection intensity may not be great, not as good as, I guess, in cashmere and sort of into Asia, and in mohair into South Africa, where they've got bigger groups to select from. They end up being able to maximise selection intensity better, or optimise selection intensity better. But for us, really, accuracy is where we've got to go in terms of making genetic gain. So we're going through each of those components, but I guess selection intensity is how few you get to select from the population. So if you had 10,000 goats and you only need to select 10 bucks from that, obviously that's a massive selection intensity, and so you can go really fast because you only need to grab the absolute pointy end of that population. Normally those numbers are more like maybe a couple of hundred, and we've got to keep one or two from that. And I guess, but essentially all selection intensity is about, if you've got a bigger herd, you can actually select a smaller number, which means you can select the freaks right out on the pointy end of the genetic distribution. We can't get away from this bell curve. This is pretty much the same as when you see a fibre diameter test on your fibre. You see that bell curve, and that's pretty. You can just imagine every trait that you've got in your goat herd is the same as that bell curve in fibre diameter. There's this variation that just sits there. It's obviously natural mutations that have occurred throughout history. And so we've got this big variation in genetics to deal with. And that all we're doing when we're selecting our genetic process is really shifting that bell curve either to the left or to the right, depending on what that trait is. And we never get away from the bell curve. We can tighten it up a bit. We hear a lot about sort of evenness and breeding even animals in terms of them all being peas in a pod or whatever. But often you can still have massive variation, even if you've been really focusing on that. And really, even when you get really inbred, you've still got quite a bit of variation, which is a big part of what we need to make genetic gain. Without variation in a trait, you can't make genetic gain. Selection accuracy is the one we're going to spend a lot of our time about, and that's making sure that when we make a selection decision, we're picking the right animals. So obviously in our doe herd, we might be keeping 50% of the doe kids or whatever might retain, and the rest get sold, or whatever that number is. Might not be as high as that, depending on your age structure. And so you're making a decision about which ones of those get to be retained. And then you're also, if you're breeding bucks, you're keeping the odd buck. Or if you're going out and buying a buck, then how the accuracy with which you select that animal is the thing that will really impact on your ability to make genetic gain. And this is where we probably need to spend, as an industry, we need to get ourselves back on track. I know like Doug Stapleton and others have spent a lot of time over the years trying to encourage the industry into more measurement. And I think the reality is, if we have to move in that direction and take a lot of our knowledge in terms of the attributes that we can see and feel and judge, but we definitely need to move towards starting to, as an industry that wants to expand and wants to reach its full potential in Australia, which I think is huge. We do need to do what the sheep industry is now doing really well, which is measuring a lot of traits and using breeding values, and same in the cattle industry. The sheep industry was certainly dragging the chain a bit, but we've seen a massive uptake in the use of breeding values over the last 10, 15 years. And back, I don't know, a few of you might remember the 2002, we did a progeny test, which I'm about to present some data from. But we demonstrated back then that there's this big variation, and everyone that's ever done anything in the Angora goat knows that there's this big variation that we won't capture properly unless we use full data. And that's not something we can solve tonight because we don't have the systems that are properly in place to do that. There is KID plan, but it's probably not ideal. But as an industry, it's a discussion we need to engage in and work out how we get ourselves sorted. It's we have been dominated by the show ring, and that's served the industry well. But we definitely need to move towards combining that with some measurements going forward. And it is a struggle with smaller herds around the place to get good data because we've got small numbers of progeny in each place. But we do have anyway. There's a good discussion that needs to be had there, and it doesn't need to have any emotion attached to it at all. It's just a discussion around, right, let's get serious as an industry and work at how we go as fast as possible in terms of improving the animals, improving their farmability. And I think that'll come more around the traits that we can't see than the traits that we can, which we'll talk about as we go through. So there's a few graphs coming up. I'm a scientist, I like graphs, but I just wanted to use them and it's old data now, it's 2002, it makes me look very old. This back relatively early in my career, we had a RERDIC, which is what Agrifutures was called before Agrifutures, Rural Institutes Research and Development Corporation. We funded a progeny test, and Bruce McGregor and myself ran that at Liddy's property there near Horsham with Rowena and Glenn and June and Bob, and yeah, with support from my colleagues at Hamilton. And so that was back a long time ago, but we had these 11 sires. Is there 11 up there? I think there's 11 that came from the industry, and we ran them over, artificially inseminated them over a common group of does at the Liddy's property, and then measured those progeny, which was one of the very few progeny tests that's occurred in Angoras, and it was aimed to set up sort of to be the catalyst for, I guess, more measurement in the industry. It didn't go that far. Not long after that, I ran off to Perth and did a PhD, and but yeah, I think it's something we need to reconsider, and anyone that's been around for a while will have seen the work that Doug Stapleton kept doing and publishing on various things in terms of buck trials and stuff. So there's been lots of data over the years. But if we focus on this graph, on the horizontal axis where we've got those bigger fleece weights, so when these bucks were entered into the progeny test, that we asked the breeders what their fleece weight was, and so that's the same fleece weight you would get if you asked a buck breeder today to provide you the fleece weight for that animal. If it was one you were considering buying. And so they range from over 7 kilos down to under 3 kilos in their third fleece weight that was quoted to us. And then on the other axis is when we mated those animals to the same group of does and then looked at the progeny, what was the fleece weight of those bucks genetically. So what's the DNA of those animals to cut mohair, and you'll see there that there's pretty much, well, I guess some are sort of correlated and then some are just random. And so as a group, it looks pretty random. There's no real correlation there, although there's probably 5 or 6 that did. And I don't think this is definitely not saying those breeders were lying to us. What it is saying, though, that some of these animals were running in really, really safe, nice country where it is conducive to growing mohair, and we know some of those areas. But if you're in like the Mallee was a great place where Tim is and where I grew up. It was a great place because animals hardly ever had a worm. It wasn't that cold. It was well suited to Angora goats, and if you kept the feed up to them, they're quite happy. And then other areas in Australia we know that are much less I guess conducive to happiness for animals generally, ruminants generally, and Angora goats being part of them. And so they have a lower fleece weight just because they're struggling through a worm burden or cold or whatever. Anyway, so I guess the point here is that this is the variation that we have. Our ability to make an accurate selection decision is heavily influenced by the environment with which those animals are running. And so we have to be very careful when we're trying to compare animals at a show or with our measurements, because the environment has a massive impact on how that animal is expressing itself. So one graph to demonstrate that, if we swing that over to micron, so this is again the breeder supplied buck third fibre diameter, so those third fleeces. The other one on that previous graph was probably just the variation. Although it's squeezed down, it was a tough year to have a progeny test. They didn't animals didn't do that well. It was basically a really severe drought. But anyway, still ranging from sort of almost just over 2 kilos to 2.4 kilos, so a sort of fairly 25-30% difference in fleece weight, which is what we would expect. So that's the variation that sits there that we need to capture as an industry. If we swing to fibre diameter again, you could argue bugger all correlation there between what the breeder thought or had measured the animal to be, and then what it actually the progeny tested out as. And these sort of things that come into fibre diameter will be sampling error, when it was taken, where it was taken, how much feed it was on when it was taken. But I guess the point again is that if you're being quoted a micron or fibre diameter, something that's quite accurate to measure, but it's only as good as how much feed's gone down that animal's throat. There's a genetic component and there's an environmental component, and it's really hard to separate out that genetic component unless we've got something like a breeding value, which is kind of the point of these graphs, is that if we had a breeding value for that third fibre diameter for those bucks and we were putting it next to their correlate, I can do that in sheep. I do it all the time. We get quite a nice correlation between what the breeding value is for that animal versus what the progeny actually do. So we could have tidied up a lot of that error by having better information available to us. And obviously we had breeding values after this progeny test, but we didn't have them before. And yeah, it's, I guess, again, let's look at the variation that sits there in the progeny, sort of, which is the one that counts. There's about a 4 micron variation in those third fleeces, remembering that these are a progeny test group, so only half the genes is coming from dad, so the other half from mum, obviously. So you can actually double those gaps. So genetically, there's an 8 micron difference between those, because obviously the size only contributing half the gene. So there's a massive variation that sits there, and these are old bucks now, and then their names will actually come up in a minute, but that's irrelevant. They'll all be long gone, and many of their progeny will be long gone, but and grand progeny and great grand progeny probably, but they're still relevant in terms of just the variation. And if we tested a group of bucks today, they might sit at a different average, but they would have the same variation. And again, none of these bucks were like culls or anything. They were all animals that people thought were worthy of progeny testing, so we're quite somewhat proud of, or at least at the time thought they were pretty good animals. But yeah, I guess as an industry, we've got this big variation to work with. I just thought while we were looking at that data, we'd also look at the correlation between the two, because this is something that as breeders we need to, this is a key correlation we need to battle, whether you're growing cashmere or mohair. It's the micron fleece weight or down weight in terms of cashmere trade-off that we're sort of always trying to work on. Obviously, we get paid for finer fibre, and in both cases, it's quite a premium for the finer fibre. But we need to, but generally they're favourably correlated, well, it's positively correlated with fleece weight. So if we want more fibre, we get slightly stronger fibre, and therefore it becomes less valuable. And that's the trade-off we're always trying to beat, whether it's in a merino sheep or in a Angora goat or a cashmere goat. And so you'll see here there is like a kind of a positive correlation. Again, it's not that strong, but you can also see there's animals there that, and so we've got fleece weight, sorry, down on the x-axis, on the horizontal axis, and we've got fibre diameter of these progeny on the y-axis. So you've got some animals that are cutting the same fleece weight, but are that 4 microns finer, or pretty similar fleece weight, or 3.5, 4 microns finer along this axis. Equally at the same fibre diameter, you've got animals cutting sort of 300 grams more. And again, if you're remembering, that's half of dad's genes, so you can double those numbers. So there's lots of variation we can work with. We can sort of break down some of the correlations, and many of you have sort of, I guess, as an industry, we've bred these pretty handy animals since the good old days of the Australian genetics, by combining what we see and a few measurements. I argue we could have done that a whole lot faster if we had have used all the right tools over that time, but that's history now. It's about how we go forward as an industry and how we sort of organise ourselves to breed a really high performing economic goat to run. The same's happened in cashmere. There's only a few breeders, but those that have stuck with it have definitely broken that correlation. They've got down weight up a lot and have managed to maintain fibre diameter, and which is so all it takes is a bit of accuracy and some time to achieve great things. In the cashmere industry, they have been a bit more focused on getting, I guess, a bit more performance data on them. It's there's only a few breeders that have done it, so I guess it's up to them how they did it. Feel free to chuck a question in the chat, and happy to have a crack, but we'll keep moving along. One thing I just wanted to talk about before, which has kind of been intimating, but is heritability, which is the proportion of variation amongst a group of animals that we can attribute to the genes. So if we look at we've got a herd of 100 doe kids, and we micron test them all, and we get all that numbers. So the heritability is the proportion of that variation in micron that is actually attributed to genes, and the rest is due to whether they were born a single, born a twin, out of a maiden, out of an old ewe, which paddock they're in, how much, whether they're born 5 weeks after another one or whatever. All the variation that we would see in a paddock is the other stuff going on. And then there's also just random things that we sort of variants that we just can't account for through pedigree. So heritability is kind of interesting because we need to know that a trait is heritable. We need variation to work with, and we need a trait that's heritable to make genetic gain. The important thing is that, and I'm about to show you what the heritabilities are for a range of traits that we work with in Angoras. The important thing is more than half of what we see is not genetic. So when we're looking at an animal, we're measuring an animal, more than half of what we're seeing and measuring is not actually going to pass on into the next generation. And so we need to be really careful about, are we just looking at an animal and liking it because it's a single born out of an older ewe and therefore is a few kilos heavier, cutting a bit more fibre, and has probably got better secondary follicle development and therefore is cutting a little bit finer mohair as well. So things that in genetics, a lot of our job is really working out where the smoke is and where the actual fire is. And heritability is one of those things that we need to get a head around a bit. The beauty of moving into a world where breeding values sort of reign is that heritability is already taken into the equation. So by the time you're looking at the actual number, you already know that's what you're going to take home in the animal, which is why they're so powerful. But anyway, it's an important concept to know that, because I think when we look at an animal, we just think it's almost a 3D print of its genes, which it's not. It's a combination of its DNA as well as the environment it was raised in, and we raise them in very different environments, and we often, any of us that have gone to the trouble of preparing a show team can demonstrate, have clearly seen how much you can change an animal based on how well you feed it, and if you protect it from the elements and do a few things, you can really influence what it looks like and what it measures like. There's a heap of data for you, and this recording will go up, so you can rewatch it if you want to look at these numbers, or I can send this talk to you. But we'll put the slides up as well onto the hub. But yeah, there's the heritabilities of the various traits that we might consider in an Angora goat. In a cashmere goat, we're down to mainly down weight and fibre diameter and a few others, but the weight traits are there as well. So most of them around 30%, which is kind of moderate. High is like pigment is quite high at 46%. Face cave is quite high. Then down to style is one of the lower. Style and character evenness are probably some of the lower ones. But we're all the traits that we might consider, and that's not all of the traits that you would consider, but all of them are in the moderate range for moderate to high range for heritability. So that just tells us that if we want to change something, we can, and it's up to us to make good selection decisions to do that. And a lot of these things we have changed just through visual selection, like things like modulation and chem. You can assess an animal pretty well for that. You know which spots to look at and what to look for. and but I guess things like face cover, I think probably could get ourselves into an argument tonight about face cover. I guess as an industry, we've sort of, maybe the show scene has rewarded face cover as a bit of a proxy for fleece weight, same as it did in merinos, and a lot of people like a full head cover on an animal. But you'll see in South Africa, which is probably running a bit more of a commercial focus. You're seeing that those animals are really getting stripped off through the head, and that's mainly, well, there's a favourable correlation with reproduction, obviously, to get around. If you're not wigging those animals, not taking that face cover off, it becomes a production barrier. In a commercial enterprise, I think we need to think about our gear change, I suppose, to think about, right, if we want a serious commercial industry, we have to breed a serious commercial Angora goat. And I think face cover might be one of those things that we have to reconsider how we put an animal together. Your average sheep farmer is not going to be that keen on wigging an animal twice a year to keep it so it can see where it's going. But and there's certainly ways, I guess, being at 38% heritable, we could shift it quite quickly without having any negative impact on anything else if we wanted to. Same with belly and point cover, and I think that's, again, those bare legs, bare heads are probably an animal that South Africa's moved towards. They call them Hilbecker or something. And they certainly did that in the sheep as well, and that was mainly for, I guess, ease of management, and sort of interesting whether we can move our direction that way in the industry, and that's, again, doesn't need any emotion around that. It just depends on what you like in an Angora goat, and whether we think we can, what a commercial and enterprise running 1,000 of these animals wants to have in their animals. And might be people online that run 1,000 of them and can tell me that answer. What else we got in there? I guess the things that, the other one is pigment. Again, probably hard to justify on a commercial attribute whether it matters whether they've got black spots, skin spots. Obviously, black hair is a no-no. But most of us who like breeding don't like having pigment on animals, so that'd be something that. But again, that's 46% heritable, so we can take that black pigment off pretty clearly, and most of you will have seen that. If you use a buck with plenty of pigment, you end up with plenty of pigment. Obviously, it changes over time, which is a bit of a battle. Like sometimes, obviously, they're not born with it, and that it evolves over time or develops over time. So, one of those things we need to keep assessing, I suppose. But being at 46% heritable, we know that any of us have played around. You can, if you select for animals that don't have pigment, you certainly reduce it pretty quickly, which is backed up there by that heritability. That's probably enough for that one. So, yeah, and I guess I'm trying to explain the genetic variation as we're going, but Capra hircus, which is the domesticated goat, obviously massive genetic variation, 60 chromosomes of variation to work with. So even within our two focus animals, cashmere and Angora, there's massive variation. So we do have immense power as animal breeders. So that was black pigment, Raymond. I guess that was a South African paper, yeah, and I guess, yeah, I don't know whether brown pigment has the same heritability or not, to be honest, but obviously we've seen South Africa, well, we've all imported animals seen imports. The Texans had a lot of black pigment, and the South Africans these days have a lot of brown pigment, which seems to be I think is a good thing. I'm happy to hear otherwise, but I think obviously they're really it seems like under high UV that like that brown pigment would be better than pink skin. But I guess I was talking about those black dots on ears and nose, Raymond. So there is enormous variation within our two breeds, and so it's kind of up to us what we do with that. But there's heaps of power there if we want to utilise it to breed an animal that, and we've seen some amazing animals bred over the time, and I think we probably all sit longingly looking at about this time of year where we should be in South Africa, looking around all those ram sales over there, and see the magnificent animals. But yeah, I think there is big variation for us to work with, and obviously what we can see and has really improved a lot in terms of the style and character and fibre. That's probably the things we can't see. We need to consider a bit. Just another example of variation. Again, this was from the sire evaluation, and there'd be a blast from the past for some of those sires. And yeah, again, it doesn't really matter about who they are. They were just examples of the day. But something like kid survival, which is obviously a really critical trait commercially, and this is again just the sire effect on kid survival. So we've got, if we look at Wilton Park Clarion versus Wilton Park Casanova, which is nice because they're from the same house, so no need to get upset about the owner. But that's the worst and best, which is another great thing. Like, none of this stuff, no breeder's bad at. There's more variation within a breeder than there is between breeders generally, and same with. And so it's not about that stud's good or that stud's good. It's more, well, everyone's got variation, and where's the best animals is kind of the answer, is the question. But those two animals there, sire 5 and sire 8, so one weighing 97%, or kid survival at 97%, the other one at 77%. So again, that's just the sire effect. And on that kid survival. So massive difference in kid vigor that we can work with as an industry. And again, this is old data, but that we've seen that all of us have had kids that, or used a sire that had useless kids, and it's just nothing more heartbreaking than watching them come out and pretty much die. And that's probably where my whole career started, really, how my interest in breeding started, because of seeing one of those in particular have really, really useless kids, and kind of being interested in that whole fleece weight impact on all of that. But yeah, so a big variation there for us to play with as well in the Angora game. It's not, I haven't seen the same data in cashmere. There certainly would be variation there to work with, but I think this is probably one of the ones we need to really, probably our Achilles heel, I reckon, in the mower industry in Australia, and under the conditions with which a lot of them will need to kid commercially. We need to make sure we're putting some selection pressure on kid survival, doe rearing ability. Those sort of traits need to be front and foremost for us, I think. Moving on to onto our traits that change genetic gain. Generation interval is one of them, and so that's just the average age of your bucks and does as when that kid is born, or when that kid drop is born. And so the younger they are, the more genetic gain we make, as long as we're making all the other bits of our genetic gain equation are right. So it's one, we can influence that by keeping a younger herd. Obviously, it's inefficient to have them lots of young does and turning them over a lot, because an old doe isn't, or most of the time, an old doe isn't worth that much. But if it is, but anyway, something to consider. Basically, young. I think there is an argument to keep the doe herd as young as feasible, with the opportunity to, because all the obviously kid fibre or younger animal fibre is worth more money, but so there's some economic equations that need to be worked out there. But generation interval is one of the benefits of keeping your doe herd young. These questions don't work very well when I can't see your faces, but yeah, I guess a bit of self-reflection about how you're currently making buck buying decisions, how much information's being utilised in that. And I can't answer that because I can't see your answers. But I think a lot of us and a lot of the industry makes, and this is not just the goat industry, this is livestock generally, there's a fair bit of emotion involved in making buying decisions, and a little bit of our brain. Often that I think is probably out of kilter towards emotion, unless towards our logical thinking, and we need to, I guess, and that is kind of things like, I don't buy bucks from that person because I don't don't like them or whatever, and a range of other things, or I buy bucks from that person because they're my uncle or they're my auntie, or I went to school with them, or I used to play footy with them, or whatever the example is, which we use across the sheep and beef industries as well. I guess all I would do is encourage you to, when it comes to getting genetics, all of the personality bit needs to disappear, and it needs to just get focused on what is going to make me the most money with these genetics, or what's the best source of animals to help me have a profitable, healthy herd of goats. So I guess in terms of a pathway to breeding your perfect goat, and most of you online have done it as long as I have, if not longer. I guess one thing is that we don't see that often is kind of a clear definition of what that is. So kind of actually writing down your plan for your Angora or Cashmere goat, like what is that in 10 years time, what's it going to look like? Because it's easy to meander along, just sort of grabbing a buck here and a buck there, or keeping that buck and this buck, and not actually having any significant change over 10 years in some of the traits that you might. So measuring stuff and having a plan is really, really powerful in any breeding program. And so define what that is. I want a goat that cuts 3 kilograms of young goat when it's 3.5 year old, whatever the kind of stretch target is for you. Define what it is, then work out what your plan is to do that. What are you going to measure? What are you going to use? What are the tools you're going to use to help you get there? Obviously allocating some resources and then reflecting as you go is the kind of pathway that we encourage people to go along. I guess before we get into that, obviously I'm going to talk a lot about, well, I have talked a bit about data and stuff, but none of it says that the basics don't need to be right. I think we can make plenty of excuses for animals around whether that's data or whether that's because a judge liked them once and therefore they're a show winner or whatever. We still need to get the basics right. Hocks, pasterns, teeth. That animal in the middle there has got pretty bad black pigment. Whether some, like chalky faces in the Angora world, so indicators of Kemp, which are not a problem or not even a consideration in the Cashmere game, because we're looking at the down, the secondary follicles, fibres, not the outside coat. But yeah, I guess fundamentally an animal has to be able to walk, has to be able to function, and so they're kind of no-brainers when it comes to breeding. So we just want to get them out there, so we remember, so we don't get accused of not considering them. I guess the way we like to think about a breeding program is, and it doesn't matter what species we're playing with, is kind of across these 4 key areas. Often when we think about genetics and livestock, we think, right, how do we breed an animal to make us more money? And obviously that's important, but genetics is just as powerful at saving money, saving time, and then delighting a customers about what are the attributes of the animal or the fibre that creates value, I suppose, and that's and also we'll go through each of these in a bit of detail. But the way we think about breeding across all species is how do we use genetics to take cost out and keep our animals healthier and happier a lot, as well as how you make money, because your cost of production is influenced by both obviously your cost and your production. So you can drive up production or you can drive down cost and you'll have the same impact on profitability. And that's kind of the way we've got to think about our goat breeding, and probably an approach that I think we need as an industry to really get our heads around and make sure we've got our focus sort of balanced across these pillars. Most of the make your money traits are obvious and delight a customer traits are obvious, but the save your money, save your time traits are often either invisible or can be masked through management. So they might be very visible in some environments and not very visible in other environments. And so they're things that we need to consider as an industry, whether it's Cashmere or Angoras. I think your make your money traits are fairly obvious, but I'll go through them anyway. And obviously these are fibre specialist animals. That's their job. There's a meat part of the game, and for a fleeting moment it was a very big part of the game when it was $10 a kilo or whatever. but the reality is most of you have farmed through years where the actual meat is very much a byproduct, and that's probably how it's going to be. I mean, yeah, they are very specialist animals of a very specialist, amazing fibres, and so that has to be the focus of our make your money traits, is the fibre itself. So obviously fleece weight, fibre diameter, key. Style and character I'll use again in a minute when we're talking about delighted customer. That's obviously we get paid for the type of fibre itself, regardless of fibre diameter and fleece weight. And a lot of our classing systems are based on style and character rather than fibre diameter. I do think that if we fast forward 100 years, that will change. I think that fibre diameter is probably the key driver of with the right, roughly the right style and character, but fibre diameter will be the driver of a lot of the attributes that we're actually looking for. So it'll be interesting because we've seen that play out in the wool industry, where it was very much style or character, really, not style, and that was called style, which just makes it interesting. Whereas now, like a lot of the buying table, it's very much fibre diameter based. But anyway, that's again, this is a zero emotion discussion. I'm just calling it as I see it. But I guess stable length is important. Obviously, that's a key part of value. Can be influenced by when you shear them, obviously, but genetically as well. Consistency across the fleece. We all know that it's fine to have a beautiful mohair in the mid side or whatever, but if you've got a really strong neck or a really strong britch, then it's not as you obviously don't get as much value off that animal. So trying to keep value across the animal is important. Similar with fleece longevity, in the sense that if we can hold that younger, better fibre longer into life, that's got a lot more value in it than we know that you go from an adult or from a fine kid through to an adult, the price plummets relatively quickly at those higher microns or stronger fibres. So the longer we can hold on to that young animal, and I think that's probably as we mature as an industry, we'll do a lot more testing of older animals, because really that's where the money is. We're all going to have good kid fibre. Every animal's going to have a nice fleece, the first one. It's that second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth fleece where a lot of the money can be made or lost if it goes really strong really quickly. And then growth and reproduction are making money traits that we probably don't. Yeah, again, I talked about growth is we need enough growth to have a sort of animal that wants to eat and wants to thrive a bit, but we don't need to grow them to be massive animals or to grow them super fast, because they are, at the end of the day, they're a fibre producing animal. And then reproduction, we don't have an issue with. They tend to, if you feed them okay and look after them okay, they'll generally twin. But I guess we need to keep an eye on that, particularly those survival traits where we can have a lot of wastage going from. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in survival of animals, not necessarily having more litter size. And obviously, again, in our industry where kid fibre is the most, or in Angora's kid fibre is the most profitable or valuable fleece, those early three fleeces, 3 and 4, obviously higher reproduction, more kids, more money from that kid fibre potentially. So yeah, again, I can't do the economics in my head, but you're all running more goats than I am these days. But yeah, I mean, all of these traits have to balance out to be an animal that fundamentally can make money on a commercial farm. If we turn that to cashmere, that's total fibre weight, down yield, down weight, down length. So they're all the same, all adding to the same thing, which is length of the cashmere down and the weight of the down. Fibre diameter is important, and most of the series producers are white, but down colour will influence value as well. And they're all, they become the real priority. The beauty of those numbers is they're much lower than the mohair numbers, so you're not getting an animal into sort of energy deficit or trying to produce a lot of fleece weight. You're like a kilo of cashmere is heaps, versus to get the same value off Angora goat, you need a lot more of it. So so it's a different fibre completely. Obviously, it needs to be dehaired, whereas the Angora is just one fibre. Saving money traits, I think we don't do much with these traits anymore. There's been various projects over time, and some of you might still select for worm resistance a little bit, but really I don't see many people taking worm egg counts and actually selecting their animals based on egg counts. I think there's a lot of areas in Australia where Angora goats are run that this is important. You can, Steve Walkton-Brown showed this back in a Rudic project, and there's been other papers around. There is definitely genetic resistance to worms in goats, and obviously we know that goats are more susceptible to worms than sheep on average. They also metabolize drenches more quickly than sheep, and so there's whole heaps of issues with worms and goats in some environments. The further, I guess, northwest you go generally, and if you're on the eastern side, or on the western side, the further east you go, the further you get away from the coast, the less rainfall, the happier the goats are because they don't see any worms or see less worms. But lots of areas where we are running them in maybe areas that they don't love as much because there are worms and it's a bit cold, then there are areas where we really could do a lot of benefit by selecting animals to be resistant to worms. We've seen sheep change completely. Like the Merino is the kind of Angora. The Merino is the kind of Angora equivalent of the sheep world in terms of its resistance to worms, and we've seen them change dramatically through selection, through using the breeding values for worm resistance. So I think for this trait alone, I think it's worth us as an industry getting serious about using some breeding values, and maybe it is only worms that we look at, worms and constitution, a few things to start with, because I think it's one of our serious Achilles heels for expansion of the industry. The other save your money trait is condition score. I think in the sheep world, we've done a lot around this. This is my PhD in merinos, but basically selecting for animals that have higher fat and muscle reserves or higher energy reserves. And we saw a bit of variation in the progeny test. I didn't grab that data tonight, but there's sire variation out there, so there's opportunities to improve this. And yeah, it'll be an easy trait to do. You just condition score your young does and the ones that are doing well. You record that, and those that aren't, you record that, and we select those that are doing well. And I think that'll flow through to being a much more viable animal. We saw that a lot, probably. There's lines of, I guess generalising is risky, but certainly there were some African lines that came out that were a lot more robust than some of the Texan lines. And I think if we had a condition score breeding where it would have shown which was which under those scenarios. Obviously, there's a lot of crossover, and we can't generalise across those two big countries now. But I do think there's significant potential for us to produce an animal that wants to maintain condition and therefore can be run at higher stocking rate without collapsing. And these are things that we would explore if we had, or we need to explore to help us expand into a wider industry. Save your money, save your time are often similar traits, but I guess feet health is something I put into save your time. That's an animal with pretty shocking front feet, if you can look into that, and we'll all probably seen animals like that in our days, and we've paired animals like that. I don't know what it is about Angora goats and their desire to grow some terrible feet sometimes, not all of them. And so, again, we've seen this I couldn't find many papers on this really in terms of the heritability or much work at all on that. A lot of the big research in Angora has obviously been done in South Africa, and for whatever reason, I guess it's the Karoo wearing down their feet, like a pretty harsh environment on walking around rocks and stuff, so they probably keep well worn. We bring them over here, put them on either clay soils or sandy soils that don't wear the feet very much, and you can get into some interesting feet. And yeah, definitely, I haven't done the work in goats, but we've definitely done a lot of work in sheep in the last. In fact, Georgia Online has leading up our project in Victoria at the moment, looking at sheep feed health, and we've certainly done. The reason I ended up in New Zealand in the first place was to do a feed health work in Rhinos. We've seen massive variation in our ability to actually select animals that maintain a really well-shaped foot, are less prone to things like scald and foot rot. Sorry, those things aren't correlated. So we can select an animal that's got good foot shape. We can also select an animal that's got resistance to foot rot and resistance to scald. They're not always the same thing, but yeah, there's immense variation out there, I'm sure, in Angora that we haven't, or Angora and Cashmere that we haven't really investigated. I know the Cashmere breeders in New Zealand, Hectare Cashmere down south, have definitely culled through animals and have got a much better foot on the Cashmere goats these days than they would have back in the day. They're running them under pretty high rainfall, obviously putting selection pressure on worms and feet and that sort of stuff, and showing that you can run goats in those environments. And it's all just a matter of selecting for the right traits at the right time and balancing it out with other traits. So there's a whole heap of things that kid viability is one of those things for anyone that's doing some semi-intensive kidding. Kids that get up and run are the ones that say they cost you no time at all. Those that you got to do something with, or if you're into the intensive kidding, they're the ones that will cost you heaps of time. And then the final quadrant we like to select on is delighted customer, and I guess for us in the mohair world, that's often style and character. We get paid for the right type of fibre, whether that's weaving or whether that's just your standard fibre types, but the stuff that's been graded into the better classes and then assessed as being high quality. Things like camp and modulation fit in that delighted customer range. Obviously, one of in the mohair world, you get a camp fibre or a modulated fibre that sneaks through processing, and then you dye it to a dark colour and it stands out like the proverbial. And that's the reason that your processors don't want campy fibre. Obviously, camp comes out normally in the combing process, but the longer modulated fibres are a real battle and very expensive for a processor. They've got the only way you get rid of that is literally pluck them out with tweezers out of the fibre, out of the fabric. So that's not something that anyone wants to be doing, because you're paying someone a lot of money to do bugger all. And so yeah, that's another delighted customer trait. And then I think if we bring this thing whole circle or full circle, meeting the RMS, the Responsible Mohair Standard, like looking after welfare of animals. If we set our animals up right in terms of genetics, then it's much easier to meet some of those standards. And I think we can produce mohair in a very customer friendly way. We do now, but we can improve that even further through getting the genetics of animals right. That's certainly our big focus in the sheep game, is working a lot on these traits so that we can reduce chemicals and reduce labour and improve welfare in animals through how we shape the DNA, as much as the sort of production focus that we all have as well. Just quickly, a camp image. We all know what we're talking about there, but obviously hollow fibres, and I've talked about why they're nasty. These are Bruce McGregor's drawings, I think. But we're obviously looking for an animal or for a fibre that doesn't have any hollows, because it will die completely. And the beauty of one of the things we're famous for, or mohair is famous for, is its ability to take dye and dye to bright colours. And the last thing we need is something that's not taking that bright colour, which is the modulated fibre. So that's been, I guess, probably one of the big wins over the years. If we think back to, I think 1992 might have been our first drop of animals, and they were all Aussies and fairly well full of camp. Whereas these days you get a look around, and obviously there's still a bit around, but a lot less than there was back then. And that's probably the one thing that gets us discounted across in the South African market is levels of modulation, and that's probably more of an artifact. I think we've certainly got as good of animals. They're just not as evenly distributed in Australia as they are in South Africa, probably. But yeah, certainly something that's moved a lot over those years. We've done well as an industry in importation of genetic gain. I think we probably haven't done as well in once we get them here how we improve them, and that's mainly through scale. I'm not blaming anyone. I was as much to blame as anyone really. It's just that we all at small scale and probably do a lot of competition when we could be doing a lot of working together rather than competing. And that's an industry that I think has got a lot of potential if we can get our head around working together in some of these breeding programs and working for the greater good rather than trying to sell the odd buck here and there. I think I'm getting close to the hour and getting close to finishing up, and then I guess one thing I would ask everyone online to do that's breeding goats is to leave tonight and make a plan. I want you to write down what your objective is for the next 10 years, because I always kind of at risk of sounding half crazy, but I do think if you write a plan down, you're much more likely to achieve it. And I think there's a whole heap of psychology around that. There's also a whole heap of power in your subconscious brain to help you make decisions and help you find stuff when you're not looking for it. And so writing down a plan is a really important part of achieving a plan or achieving change. On our website, it's sort of sheep and beef focused, but we'll build one that's a goat focused one. But if you go to nextgenagri.com, under the resources section, there's a downloadable PDF there, which will just take you through those 4 pillars of make your money, save your time, and delight a customer. It is written sheep and beef, but you can just cross those words out and put doe and buck or goat and goats in there, because the aspects are the same. The 4 pillars are the same, and I think writing down the things that you'll end up with 5 traits that you're focused on, and a bit of it just leads you through a bit of a process of having a genetic plan. It's obviously a simple one. You can do a lot more than that if you wish. But I do encourage you to actually write down what you want to achieve, because it's very easy to cruise along thinking you're making a game. But if you're measuring nothing and you're not actually comparing it with anything, then it's pretty easy. And you sort of forgot what you wanted last year. It's pretty easy to just not actually make much genetic gain at all. And I guess one thing that probably gets me out of bed every day is the opportunity to make genetic gain. The sort of 3, 4, 5% improvement we can make every year if we do the right selection, I think is there's not many free lunches in agriculture, and even genetic gain is not free, but it's as close to free as you've got to buy a buck. You're going to keep a buck anyway, and so you may as well keep or buy the right one, or keep or buy the right does. So I do think it's an opportunity for us, whether we're running sheep, beef, goats, whatever, alpacas. We have that opportunity to make 4 or 5% genetic gain every year if we choose to. It does take a bit of work. It takes a bit of focus. It takes a bit of forgetting some things. We have to unlearn some stuff, and we have to learn some new stuff. And that's been a nice therapeutic process for me over the years, to go from very much loving what I see and breeding that way to utilising some information to help do that in a whole lot more accuracy. I think the beauty of genetics is that, and the beauty of us having subjective skills, being able to assess things, we can actually put scores on stuff, get that turned into breeding values, or get that turned into information corrected for some of the fixed effects, and then you can use all your skills and just, but actually be more powerful with your skills if we put a bit of extra data around that, I think. And I think it's a conversation we'll continue to have in the industry, and something I'd be keen to. If you've got any ideas, or if you want to challenge me on email or whatever, that's great. But I do think as an industry we've got this massive potential. I think the goat fibre industries in Australia have like huge potential, but we don't reach them. We will struggle to reach that potential unless we seriously breed the animal that will run out there and do the job for a farmer that doesn't love goats as much as we might, but loves the money and loves the opportunity that they will create. And I think that's kind of where we need to be as an industry, using our skills as breeders to maybe think about what people unlike us would need rather than people like us would need in terms of that future Angora goat. And obviously we can learn a lot from what our South African colleagues do, and see how they change the animals. We've probably got the opportunity to run a higher fleece weight, or we have got the opportunity to run a higher fleece weight animal than they do, because we're not running under the really severe conditions that they are, and we have the opportunity to supplementary feed and things that are difficult where they run them. So we have a different goat, a different opportunity. It's not, we don't have to be exactly the same, but we do have to think about what that combination might look like. That's it for me, right on the hour, which is very unusual for me to be on time. For those of you, I assume you have joined via the Gateway, so you know about it. The podcast we're putting up every now and again. We'd love to get some new guests on there. So if you know anyone, or you'd love to talk to us about what you do, I'd love to hear from you. I'm happy to have a conversation with you about your experience and your journey in Angoras or cashmere goats. We do struggle to get people to want to talk to us, but I think podcasts are a great medium for us to tell our story across a wider industry, a wider group. George has just put up a form in the a survey in the note section. If you haven't done that survey, we'd love for you to do that. We just really want to mention the Agrifutures team that's supporting us, and the steering committee on this project that support the project. It's been going a little while, but we've got a lot of great things coming, and I think we'd love to see some more posts on the Gateway. If you've got a question about what you should drench or what you should do, we'd love for you to throw it on there, and we'll happy to try and answer. But ideally, we get our industry working together, and it's an opportunity to answer each other's questions and actually interact properly. Line breeding and fleece growers. I've been breeding cats. So Rebecca's got a question on line breeding. I've never been breeding cats. There's a bit of line breeding happens in Angoras a little bit, and in all sheep species. So you can take inbreeding up to sort of 15-20% if you want. It does get risky, or as long as you've taken no faults with you, it's okay. But if you take a fault with you, you just really lock that in, which becomes problematic. You can certainly improve evenness, but you won't. There's no real value in line breeding over straight out quantitative improving the traits. And so you could line breed yourself into a more even type of fibre probably, but you'd give away some of your vigor, which is something we need. We haven't got enough already. We don't need to give any away. And so I think you'd be better off. You don't have to go nuts on keeping lines very separate. I think there's two ends of the spectrum. Some people get really tight with their line breeding, and other people get panic about having to get a new buck every 2 years because we can't use that one because we've used him before or whatever. I think there's a happy medium somewhere that obviously you can get away with a level of inbreeding. You just need to be a little bit careful. So I think the way I would approach that question, Rebecca, is to not purposefully line breed for. If you can get a bit of data and start measuring the stuff that's important to you, start finding the animals that make you money and then multiply them. That might lead you down an inbreeding path a little bit, but that's sort of a better off to end up line breeding because you're chasing performance than line breeding to try and get performance, I suppose, if I've answered that question in any way, shape or form. Right. If there's any other questions, chuck them in the chat. Otherwise, you can chuck them on the hub anytime. I'm happy to answer them. And yeah, if I've sparked a tiny spark of interest in maybe getting something going to do something better as an industry and try and leverage all of the great skills we've got in the industry and see if we can collectively really crank the genetics along. We're happy to have a chat. We're happy to see an email. Mark at nextgenagri.com, or just chuck. You can send me a note on the gateway. But it's just ticked over 10 o'clock here in New Zealand, so if there's no more questions, we might call it a night. Unfortunately, the Kiwis like to go daylight savings. Anyway, can't really make that excuse because it's only yesterday it changed, but we like to go a week earlier for some unknown reason. And for those who knows Susie Patterson, her video should be coming in fairly shortly. So she's the next case study. So a good chat with Susie the other day that will come up as a video on the gateway soon. Righto. Thanks all. Enjoy your evening, and we'll see you next time on the gateway. Thank you.